The millionaire saw his former maid with twins at the airport. Then the truth changed everything. The departure hall of Seattle International Airport buzzed with the chaotic rhythm of a Monday morning. The artificial lighting bathed the space in a sterile glow, while the echo of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and the robotic drone of flight announcements created a familiar symphony of modern transit. Amid the blur of business suits, backpacks, and coffee cups, one man stood out, not because he was strikingly handsome in a tailored gray suit, but because there was something about him that made people notice without knowing why. Ethan Callahan, 39, CEO of a luxury restaurant empire spanning California, embodied success. His gaze was calculating, his steps purposeful. For Ethan, every minute was an opportunity, every silence a strategy. His life was airports and mergers, power lunches, and flawless control. But that morning, something made him stop. Across the waiting area, past a row of worn-out plastic chairs and a flickering departure screen, he saw something that made the air shift. A woman lay on the cold floor, her head resting on a thin backpack. On her chest, two toddler boys, twins barely over a year old, slept beneath a faded blanket. There was nothing unusual about seeing exhaustion in an airport. But something about her presence, her stillness, unsettled him. Light brown hair tumbled loosely over her forehead, partially covering her face. Her clothes were simple, a worn coat, frayed sneakers. Yet the way she adjusted the blanket to better cover the children, though her own shoulders shivered, hit Ethan like a punch to the chest. There was something familiar. She shifted slightly, and then her eyes opened, stormy gray-blue, soft and deep like the Pacific at dawn. Sophie. Her name whispered into his brain like a forgotten song. In a flash, memories flooded in. The woman who used to drift silently through his family's San Francisco estate, cleaning the tall library windows while humming to herself. The woman he hadn't protected. He remembered 2 years ago, Sophie Rivera had been a part-time helper in the Callahan family's private library, a quiet space filled with old books where she kept order and dust at bay. Ethan remembered the first time he saw her, shy, respectful, never intrusive, always gentle, always composed. And then, one day, his mother, Margaret Callahan, powerful and unyielding, came home early from a vacation. She caught Sophie standing near Ethan in the library, just as he was asking her about an antique poetry book she had found among the stacks. The conversation ended the moment Margaret entered. The accusations began the next. "What kind of girl are you, trying to seduce the heir to the Callahan name?" Ethan remembered how Sophie froze, her face pale, her hands trembling. And what haunted him most was that he said nothing, not a word, not in her defense, not against his mother. He just stood there, paralyzed by loyalty or cowardice, or both. Margaret demanded her dismissal that very day. And just like that, Sophie was gone. No letters, no calls, no trace. Now here she was, lying on an airport floor with two sleeping toddlers, boys whose eyes mirrored the ones Ethan saw in the mirror each morning. Before he could think, his feet began moving toward her. She looked up, their eyes met, and in that suspended instant, both of them knew this was not over. Ethan stopped just a few steps away from her. His chest tightened, as if every memory he'd buried came crashing down at once. She looked at him, wide-eyed, stunned, and fiercely guarded. Sophie instinctively pulled the two children closer. Her arms curled around them protectively, as if his very presence might unravel the fragile world she'd spent 2 years building. It's really you?" Ethan said, voice low and rough, like he was afraid speaking too loudly would shatter this moment. "Mr. Callahan." Her voice was soft but firm. She still remembered his name, clearly. But the way she said it no longer carried the deference of a former housekeeper. It was the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned to survive. "I didn't expect to see you here," Ethan murmured. He didn't know where to start. An apology? Small talk? An explanation? Everything felt too late. Sophie nodded slowly. No one ever does. A silence settled between them. Ethan's eyes drifted to the twin boys, tiny, peaceful faces, but they held a truth more undeniable than anything she could say. They were his. His throat tightened. He didn't dare ask, didn't dare assume, but in his bones, he knew. How old are they?" he finally asked. 20 months, Sophie replied. Her gaze never left his, as if weighing whether he deserved to ask. Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. "They look like you." She finished the sentence for him. Her voice held no blame, no warmth, only cold truth, as sharp as the airport's air-conditioned chill. He sat on the bench beside her, keeping distance. "Why didn't you reach out to me?" Sophie gave a soft laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Reach out? For what, Ethan? When your mother threw me out of your home and you said nothing? When I left that night, already carrying life inside me, and the only man who could have stood up for me chose silence." Ethan felt his chest tighten further. Every word was a needle, not because she was cruel, but because she was right. "I'm sorry," he said. Simple, honest, because no other word could contain the weight of his regret. Sophie didn't respond. She glanced down at Chris, the younger twin, resting against her chest. Her fingers gently brushed his hair. "Is there anything I can do?" Ethan asked, almost in a whisper. I want to help." Sophie stared at him, her eyes unreadable. A long silence stretched between them, heavy like fog on a winter sea. Then she looked away, voice low but piercing. "You already did, Ethan, 2 years ago, with your silence." There was no bitterness in her voice, only the sound of an old wound that never quite healed. A week after the unexpected airport encounter, Ethan couldn't shake the image of Sophie curled on the cold floor, holding her sons close. During meetings, investor lunches, even behind the wheel of his sleek Bentley, his mind wandered to somewhere off the map, to the 3 lives he had once walked away from. He tried emailing an old contact of hers. No response. He didn't know if she'd changed her address or simply chose not to answer. In the end, he asked his assistant to discreetly track her flight records from that day. From a few scattered breadcrumbs, he learned she had flown to a small coastal town called Astoria, Oregon, a place he'd seen on travel brochures but never thought he'd visit. Wind up. He canceled everything. Stocks could drop. Deadlines could be missed. But his heart couldn't wait any longer. Astoria welcomed him with salty Pacific air and hills shaded in gray and green. No skyscrapers, no 5-star hotels. Just winding streets lined with cottages, family-run cafes, and weather-worn homes painted in fading blue. Ethan rented an old Jeep from the local airport and drove himself to a modest inn called Coastal Rest, the same name he vaguely remembered from a parcel Sophie once received. "Hi there, I'm Linda, the owner," said a woman in her 50s, warm smile creasing her cheeks. "How long are you planning to stay?" "I'm not sure. A few weeks, maybe." Ethan tried to sound casual, though his pulse was racing. Linda handed over a key. "Only 1 room left, small but quiet. It's in the back, near the garden." He nodded, thanked her, and entered a room no bigger than a walk-in closet. A narrow bed, peeling paint, a shared bathroom down the hall. No air conditioning, no luxury. But Ethan didn't care. He hadn't come here for comfort. He had come to begin again. The next morning, Ethan sat under the shade of a flowering dogwood, watching the ocean in the distance. That's when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of laughter. He turned around. Sophie. She wore a faded button-up, old jeans, her hair pulled into a messy bun. Liam and Chris ran ahead of her, giggling. She bent down to pick up a fallen toy, not yet seeing him. Ethan stood. "Sophie!" She froze. 1 second, 2. Then their eyes met, and the air seemed to still. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low and cautious. He took a breath. "I came to find you, and them. I can't forget. I can't pretend like none of it happened." Sophie stared at him, disbelief coloring her expression. "You left your whole life behind. To come here?" "I lost you once. I'm not letting that happen again." She said nothing. The wind swept a strand of hair across her cheek. Liam toddled over, clinging to her leg. He glanced up at Ethan, curious, watchful. Ethan knelt, offering his hand. "Hey, buddy." Liam didn't pull away. He didn't run. He studied Ethan's face for a long moment. Then slowly he placed his tiny fingers into his father's hand. And Ethan knew this was where redemption would begin. That afternoon, Ethan took a quiet walk along the Astoria shoreline, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions inside him. The waves lapped gently at the shore. The salty air and scent of seaweed filled his lungs. That's when he saw him, an elderly man, sun-kissed skin, wearing a worn wool cap, sitting near the water's edge, mending a fishing net. "You're not from around here," the man said, his voice low, warm, and tinged with amusement, as if making conversation, not judgment. Ethan paused, surprised. "What gave me away?" The old man looked up and raised an eyebrow. "Italian leather shoes, on this sand. No one fixes nets in an $800 outfit." Ethan chuckled, for the first time in days. "Fair enough. I'm Ethan." "Jones? Jack Jones?" The man extended a calloused hand. "Been fishing these waters over 40 years. This town lives off fish, but it survives off kindness." Ethan nodded, and without knowing why, sat beside him. "You're here for a woman, aren't you?" Jones asked, eyes still on his net. Ethan offered a faint smile. "She used to work for my family. I lost her, and now I'm trying to make it right." Jones didn't reply immediately. He nodded slowly, fingers moving deftly through the torn mesh. The sea teaches two things: patience and effort. No one reels in a big catch on their first day out. Ethan watched the net, how the knots were firm, the old hands steady despite the tremble of age. In that moment, he realized he'd just met an unofficial mentor, a friend, a part of the life he was beginning to build. From that afternoon on, after meeting Mr. Jones by the shoreline, Ethan began to see Astoria through a different lens. No longer a place he had to run to out of guilt, but one that might offer him a chance to rebuild from the most basic things. And that old fisherman, with his quiet wisdom and simple words, had unknowingly planted something in Ethan he'd never truly felt before. A belief that real change was possible, if it started from the heart. Since that afternoon by the shore, after meeting Mr. Jones, Ethan began to see Astoria differently. No longer just a place he came to out of guilt, it became somewhere he could begin again, from the most ordinary things. And that old fisherman, with his quiet words and calloused hands, had unknowingly planted in him something he'd never known before: the belief that true change was possible if it started from the heart. The early days in Astoria were like learning how to live all over again. Ethan woke with the sun, not to check stock reports or emails, but to make it to the docks before daylight broke. Gone were the tailored suits and polished shoes. In their place, a faded t-shirt, worn-out jeans, and a pair of boots Mr. Jones handed him after Ethan slipped and fell on his first morning at the fish market. The ocean didn't welcome him gently. It hit him with the full weight of reality. Salt stung his skin. The smell of fish clung to him, the ropes burned his palms raw, and the rocking boat made him sick within minutes. But he didn't quit. Jones didn't praise him, nor pity him. He simply said, "You're not of the sea, but you're trying like a man who wants to be." And so Ethan kept trying. Every day he learned something new. How to tell cod from snapper, how to knot a net so it wouldn't tear, how to stay upright on a swaying boat. His once soft hands grew calloused. Each evening he returned to the inn sore, exhausted, reeking of salt and sun, but with a strange new pride blooming in his chest. There was something human in these small, hard things. And for the first time, Ethan felt close to himself. In the afternoons, when he wasn't fishing, he helped Linda around the inn, fixing pipes, painting fences, pulling weeds, scrubbing floors. The man who used to enter restaurants through VIP lounges now dried dishes beside a woman from a fishing town. When she asked him, "You doing all this for Sophie?" Ethan gave a quiet smile, tired but honest. "Not just for her, for me too." She said nothing, just nodded. Some answers don't need more words. Every evening, Ethan stood by the fence near Sophie's home. He never crossed it. He only watched from a respectful distance. Liam and Chris played in the grass, their laughter rising in the golden light. Sometimes he saw Sophie stepping out to hang laundry, her silhouette framed by the last sunlight. She didn't wave, but she didn't turn away anymore. The silence between them felt less like distance now, and more like waiting. One afternoon, Chris stumbled and fell. Sophie hadn't yet turned when Ethan rushed over. He picked the boy up gently, his voice trembling with concern. Chris didn't cry. He clung to Ethan's shoulder like he belonged there. Sophie said nothing, but the look in her eyes held something warmer than before. Perhaps gratitude, perhaps something more. Another evening, Liam tugged Sophie's sleeve and whispered, "Mom, is that man my dad?" She knelt beside him, brushing his hair back. "What do you think?" Liam looked at Ethan, then nodded. "I think he looks like me, and he makes me feel safe." Ethan heard it, though he was standing meters away. The words landed in his chest like a truth he had long been waiting for. No DNA test required. Children don't lie through instinct. And in that moment, Ethan knew. He was no longer a man seeking redemption. He was becoming a father, learning, step by step, what it truly meant to be one. Time passed in Astoria like the tide, slow, steady, and deceptively calm. Ethan was becoming part of Sophie's world, and each small step forward felt like a thread of hope being gently rewoven. But just when one dares to touch happiness, life sometimes tests whether they are truly ready to hold on to it. And this time, the storm didn't come from the sea. It came from a place Ethan thought he had left behind forever, his old family. Autumn winds began sweeping in from the Pacific, and while Astoria remained peaceful on the surface, a real storm was quietly brewing, not from the ocean, but from San Francisco. One morning, just like any other, Ethan was fixing a kitchen window for Linda when he got a call from his family's legal office. The assistant's voice was tight, hesitant, like someone who didn't want to be the bearer of bad news but had no choice. "Mr. Callahan, your mother has officially filed for custody. She's taken it to the Oregon State Court." No warning, no discussion, no courtesy call. Margaret Callahan had acted as she always did, quietly, decisively, without asking for permission. In the official petition, she claimed Ethan was mentally and financially unstable to raise young children, citing his sudden resignation, nomadic lifestyle, and erratic behavior. As for Sophie, the document painted her as an uneducated, unemployed woman incapable of providing a suitable environment for minors. The words made Ethan's jaw tighten, not out of offense, but out of fury that his mother had twisted the most honest, heartfelt chapter of his life into ammunition to tear the children away from the only love they'd ever known. He knew Margaret too well. To her, everything was reputation, image, appearances. No Callahan grandchild could grow up in a seaside cottage, barefoot in muddy grass, raised by a former housekeeper with a kind smile. Sophie sat silently at the kitchen table as Ethan relayed the news. She didn't cry, but her lips pressed into a thin line. Her hands trembled slightly on her lap. In front of her, a cup of tea sat untouched. I knew she wouldn't stay quiet, she whispered, not in despair, but with the weary tone of someone who had been pushed to the edge once before, and now saw it coming again. "We won't let her win," Ethan said firmly. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect you, protect them." She looked at him for the first time in weeks, with no barriers. "But how? I have no money, no lawyer. I don't even share their last name." That's when Ethan made his decision, not for legal advantage, not for appearances, but from the deepest part of his heart. "You don't need to," he said softly. "Not yet, not unless you say yes." Then he stood up, walked over, and dropped to one knee on the old kitchen floor, his calloused hands still marked with paint, trembling with feeling. "Sophie Rivera, will you marry me? Not to fight a court case, but so I can call you my family, legally, truthfully, and forever." She froze, eyes wide, then softened. Tears welled up without sound. There were no flowers, no ring, but it was more sacred than any grand proposal. I do?" The words were quiet but unwavering, carrying the strength of forgiveness and the hope of something new. They held each other in the tiny kitchen, surrounded by the scent of cooling tea and flour-dusted counters. In that moment, they didn't feel small. They felt whole. The legal battle hadn't even begun. But Ethan knew, starting now, they were a family, and no one could take that away. The wedding had barely faded from memory when the battle they feared most arrived, not at their door, but in a courtroom. Love had been declared. Now it had to be defended. Just 2 days after Sophie said yes, word of the custody suit from San Francisco began to ripple through the small town. Astoria wasn't fond of gossip, but people listened, especially when a wealthy matriarch from the city was trying to take 2 children away from a single mother. Linda was the first to speak. "We're not letting that woman bring her money and lawyers here to tear a family apart." Her voice was firm, like a wave-hitting stone. She called on her closest friends, a baker, a carpenter, a same-sex couple raising orphans, and of course, Mr. Jones, who had treated Ethan like a son from the moment he stepped onto the boat. That night, the town gathered in an old seaside cafe. Under warm lights and the scent of fresh pastry and salt air, they planned a wedding, not just to make things legal, but to show the court that this was a real family, and behind them stood an entire community. "The ceremony will be right behind the inn," Linda declared. "I'll bake the cake." "I'll build the arch with driftwood," said Jones, eyes gleaming. "I've got some old wedding dresses my wife saved." "I'll help fit one for Sophie," offered the town's mechanic, blushing. Ethan stood among people who were once strangers, now the very foundation of his new life. He said only one thing: "Thank you, not just for today, but for giving me a home when I thought I had none." The next day the sun was soft, the breeze gentle. The beach behind the inn had been cleaned and dressed in white stones and linen banners. A driftwood arch stood tall, wrapped in wildflowers from nearby fields. It looked imperfect, humble, and completely beautiful. Sophie stepped out in a simple white dress, no veil, no diamonds, just clean fabric, a tied-back waist, and a single sprig of lavender in her braided hair. Her eyes sparkled, not from makeup, but from the 2 boys walking beside her, Liam and Chris, her little ring-bearers. Ethan waited at the end of the path, in the sand, the wind teasing his sleeves. No tuxedo, just a white shirt and dark slacks. Yet he looked like the only man in the world, his eyes never leaving hers, as if time had slowed just for them. The local pastor officiated. No long speeches, no rituals. Just a few words, honest and sacred, as Ethan gently took Sophie's hand. "Do you promise to love, protect, and walk beside her? Not just today, but every day from here on?" "I do." No hesitation. "Sophie, do you promise to trust, forgive, and love this man? Not just for his past, but for the life you'll build together?" "I do." Her voice trembled, but stood strong like the tide. There were no rings, but there were eyes full of meaning. When their lips met beneath the orange sky, the applause that followed was quiet but full, a sound only sincerity can carry. Jones handed Ethan a small gift, a carved wooden keychain with words burned into it. For the man who didn't run away, and the family who waited. Ethan hugged the old man like a father he never had. Sophie embraced Linda, her eyes shining. "Thank you for believing in me, even when I stopped believing in myself." Linda smiled. "Family isn't blood. It's who stands beside you when the storms hit." And in that golden dusk, a modest beach wedding became proof that love doesn't need to be perfect, only real and right on time. 1 week after their seaside wedding, Ethan and Sophie entered the courtroom at the Astoria District Courthouse. No guests, no flowers, no applause. Just a wooden bench, a stern-faced judge, and across the room, Margaret Callahan, poised in a dark designer suit, her face composed like she was stepping into a board meeting. Beside her, 2 high-profile lawyers from San Francisco, thick files in hand and confident eyes, as if this case were already won. And Sophie? She wore a pale blue dress, her fingers laced tightly with Ethan's. No makeup, just steady eyes. Around them stood neighbors, not attorneys, but people who knew their story. Mr. Jones, Linda, the local pastor, the bakery couple. No exhibits, only honesty and heart. The hearing lasted nearly 3 hours. Margaret's legal team tried to frame Ethan and Sophie as unstable, financially, mentally, and environmentally. But one by one, the townspeople took the stand, sharing what they had seen. Ethan up before dawn, working the boats. Sophie caring for the boys with endless patience. A beach wedding witnessed by a whole community. No exaggerations, just truth. When the judge finally read his ruling, the room fell silent. His voice was calm but resolute. Given the emotional stability, direct parental involvement, and demonstrated capacity for care, this court awards full custody of Liam and Chris to their biological parents, Ethan and Sophie Callahan. Petition denied. No applause, no cheers. Just a soft, audible gasp from Sophie as she turned to Ethan and wrapped her arms around him, holding on like she would never let go. Linda wiped a tear. Jones simply nodded, lips pressed together to hold back emotion. As for Margaret, she stood in silence. No words, no drama, just the slow, hollow sound of her heels clicking down the courtroom floor. That day, it wasn't just one family that had been defended. It was a reminder to everyone in that room. Some things can't be bought with influence or wealth. They're protected by something much stronger: true love. By the following spring, what had once been a patch of empty land behind Coastal Rest Inn was transformed into a cozy wooden house with a red tile roof and white-painted window frames. Hanging out front was a hand-lettered sign, Sea Breeze Guest House. Sophie designed it. Mr. Jones helped frame it. And Ethan? He dug every inch of foundation with the same calloused hands that now held more than just tools. They held purpose. They had no blueprints, no investors, but they had an idea, patience, and a real family. Each brick laid was a quiet declaration. The past may have hurt, but the future is built one act of hope at a time. The guest house was modest, just 5 rooms, but each carried the scent of salt air, new wood, sunshine, and the sound of children's laughter echoing through open windows. Guests didn't just come to rest. They came to belong. Ethan wasn't just a host. He took visitors fishing, taught them to mend nets, and led morning boat trips. Sophie ran small cooking classes with local seafood and garden herbs. The kids helped set breakfast tables, played harmonica at sunrise, and sometimes led guests to the beach to hunt for seashells. It was simple, and it was everything. One summer morning, as Ethan set breakfast trays, Sophie stepped out from their small back room, her hands resting on her belly, her smile brighter than the sun behind her. "Guess what?" she whispered, guiding his hand to her stomach. His heart skipped. His eyes widened. "Are you sure?" She nodded, eyes glistening. "We're going to have another." The following March, Benjamin Callahan was born, right there in that same back room overlooking the ocean. No bright hospital lights, just a midwife from the village, Sophie's calm breath, and Ethan's steady hand holding hers the whole way through. Since then, every morning, with gulls circling above and waves lapping at the shore, Ethan could be seen walking slowly along the wet sand, gently rocking a tiny baby in his arms. The man who once led a tech empire was now father of 3, patient husband, and the pillar of a home built not on fortune, but on love. Under Ethan's care, Seabreeze Guest House grew in its own way, not into a resort, not with outside funding. Instead, he built a community tourism experience. Guests could sail with Mr. Jones, cook their own catch, learn rope knotting or palm weaving. Children joined storytelling circles with Sophie or helped bake fish pies. Adults attended slow living sessions under the bougainvillea canopy, listening to the sea and the stories it carried. Winter brought fewer guests, but just enough. Ethan spent those quieter days writing, his life story, not for fame, but for his kids one day. "Sometimes the best things don't come from how far we go," he wrote, "but from having the courage to stay, to face what's ours, and start over." Liam and Chris grew fast, playing piano at weekend dinners, helping guests, and asking Sophie when Benjamin would be old enough to play pirate games with them. Sophie remained the gentle, resilient soul she'd always been. The woman who never thought she'd have a whole family, yet became the heart of one. As for Ethan, the man who once called himself a failure at being human, now lived every ordinary day with quiet gratitude. No longer the CEO who walked away, he was the man who rebuilt his life with love, one sunrise at a time. And on the farthest edge of Oregon's map, in a small guest house filled with laughter and sea breeze, one old story had finally been rewritten, with new hands, a new heart, and a brand new life. That night, the moon was unusually bright. Its silver glow spilled through the attic window of the guest house, where Ethan and Sophie often ended their days, long after the children had gone to sleep. The sea whispered in the distance, and the breeze carried a salty softness, like an embrace. Ethan sat on the wooden chair, notebook in hand. Sophie approached with 2 cups of chamomile tea. She handed him one, then settled quietly beside him, eyes gazing at the waves. After a while, without looking at him, she spoke, her voice barely more than a breath. "Did you know I once loved you? Long before all of this." Ethan turned to her, stunned. Sophie smiled gently, her eyes unguarded for the first time. "Back when I worked in that big house of your family, I fell for you. I kept it hidden because I knew my place. I never thought you'd notice a girl who scrubbed the kitchen floor. But I loved the way you worked in silence, the way you stared out windows, lost in thought. And those sad eyes I never understood back then." Ethan froze. All those years he'd blamed himself for not protecting her, not holding on. But he had never known. She had loved him, quietly, deeply, and walked away silently when it hurt too much. He set his cup down, turning fully toward her. His voice was soft, but laced with something deeper. Hope. "I've spent years wishing I'd spoken sooner, but now I have to ask, do you still love me? Now?" Sophie met his gaze. The moonlight softened her features, and her whisper was sure. "I do, and this time, I'm not hiding it." Ethan stood, walked to the drawer, and pulled out a small box. Not a diamond ring, but a simple silver band he'd engraved with both their names inside. He knelt again, not for paperwork, not for protection, not for custody. This time, He knelt for love. "Sophie Callahan," he said softly, eyes locked with hers. "The first time I asked you to marry me, it was to hold our family together. This time, I'm asking to hold your heart, not because I have to, but because I love you, fully, grown, and forever." She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She just leaned forward, nodded, and placed her hand in his. Once again, and this time, for the very first time, their love was finally spoken, and it had no walls left. 1 year later, on a golden afternoon, Ethan sat in an old wooden chair by the sea. The breeze was gentle, carrying the scent of salt and the sound of waves brushing the shore. In front of him, 3 children ran and played under the sunlight. Liam had just built a sand fortress. Chris chased after Benjamin's tiny, wobbly steps, laughter ringing through the air like a song too pure to be written. Ethan watched, smiling, not the smile of triumph, but of peace. He whispered, almost to himself, "Success isn't in contracts, it's in the laughter of my son." Sophie settled beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. She was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "I don't see myself as just a maid anymore. You made me feel like someone worth loving." Ethan took her hand, the same hand that had worked so tirelessly, and held it gently, like the last missing piece finally finding its place. The evening light melted across the sand, wrapping their world in warm gold. Sometimes love doesn't begin with "once upon a time," but with "I'm sorry and I love you."